All right, so today we're going to take a deep dive into something pretty crucial: government intervention in the market. We've got this academic excerpt that really gets into the nitty-gritty. And honestly, it's raised some questions for me that I'm hoping we can untangle together. Like, did you know that a 4% unemployment rate is considered like full employment? It
Mm.
just seems a bit odd, doesn't it?
Yeah, it's definitely one of those things that makes you stop and think. I mean, shouldn't the goal always be to have as many people employed as possible?
Right, exactly.
Well, the source material kind of dives into the reasoning behind that 4% figure. It basically boils down to the idea that there's always going to be some level of natural turnover in the job market.
Hmm.
People changing careers, industries evolving, that kind of thing.
So it's not like the government is saying 4% unemployment, that's good enough.
Hmm.
It's more about recognizing that in a dynamic economy, you can't really expect to hit zero unemployment.
Exactly. And the source material even emphasizes that it's not just about hitting some arbitrary unemployment number. It's about creating an environment where you have sustainable growth long term. Like they mentioned the Irish National Development Plan, for example. Big infrastructure projects, those are often seen as a way to stimulate the economy.
Oh, yeah, totally.
Makes you think about those massive construction projects you see popping up.
Hmm.
Have you ever stopped to consider the broader economic impact they have?
Honestly, I usually just think, oh, great, more traffic.
Hmm.
But you're right, there's a whole bigger picture there: creating jobs, supporting specific industries, hopefully improving things in the long run.
Right, and the source material actually gets into the different tools governments use to try and achieve these goals. And one of the big ones, of course, is taxation. It's not just about collecting money, it's about how that money is used to kind of nudge things in a certain
It's
direction.
like a lever they can pull, right?
Exactly. Think about that whole EU ruling on Apple's tax payments in Ireland, for example.
Oh, yeah, that was a big one. Basically, the EU was saying that Ireland was giving Apple this super sweet tax deal to lure them in, right?
That's the gist of it, yeah. And it really kicked off a huge debate about whether those kinds of tactics are fair game or whether they're giving some companies an unfair advantage.
It's definitely more complicated than just saying taxes are what we pay for the
Yeah.
government to do its thing. There's a whole strategic layer to it, right?
Absolutely. And speaking of strategy, the source material also mentions this concept of transfer payments, specifically social welfare programs. And what's interesting is that this spending, it's not actually counted when calculating national income.
Oh, really? I had no idea. Why wouldn't it be included? I mean, it's a significant chunk of government spending.
Well, it comes down to how national income is defined. It's essentially measuring the value of goods and services that are produced within a country. And social welfare, while obviously vital, is more about redistributing wealth. It's not directly tied to producing something new.
I see. So while it's obviously super important for people's well-being, it's not counted in the same way as, say, manufacturing or agriculture.
Exactly. And it really highlights how these economic indicators, even something as seemingly straightforward as national income, they can be more nuanced than they appear at first glance.
It's like there's a whole story behind the
Yeah,
numbers.
there's always more to the story.
So we've been talking about how governments try to manage the economy and all, but the source material also brings up this idea of a nanny state, you know?
Yeah.
Like sometimes it feels like there are just so many regulations. Have you ever felt that way? Like the government is trying to control every little thing.
Oh, yeah, for sure. It's a common criticism, and I think it's a valid concern. Like, where do we draw the line between protecting people and letting them make their own choices?
Right. It's a tough balance. Like think about food safety regulations or environmental protections. Obviously, no one wants to get sick from eating bad food or breathing polluted air. But then some people might argue that too much regulation stifles businesses, drives up costs, and ends up hurting consumers.
It's a classic trade-off for sure. The source material even talks about the argument that sometimes less regulation can actually be better. Like in the US, for instance, where a more hands-off approach has fostered this really dynamic free market.
Interesting.
But even there, you still see big debates about what the government should and shouldn't regulate.
It's like a constant back and forth, finding that sweet spot.
Exactly.
Now, something else the source material mentions is this idea of information asymmetry. Can you explain what that is?
Oh, yeah. Information asymmetry basically means that one party in a transaction has way more information than the other. Think about buying a used car, for instance. The seller probably knows all about the car's history, any accidents or repairs, but the buyer, they're going in blind.
Yeah, that makes sense. It's like an uneven playing field, right?
Exactly. And that's where government regulation can come in to try and level the playing field by requiring transparency, for example.
So like making sure sellers disclose certain information about the product.
Exactly. Or setting safety standards so that even if you don't know everything about a product, you can at least be reasonably sure it's not going to harm you.
So it's about creating a baseline of trust in the marketplace. If I know there are certain standards in place, I feel more confident making a purchase.
Exactly. It's all about trust and ensuring fairness.
But doesn't all this regulation add a lot of bureaucracy and red tape?
That's the trade-off, isn't it? Trying to balance those competing priorities. The source material definitely acknowledges that too much regulation can slow things down, make things more expensive.
And those costs often get passed on to consumers, so it's definitely not as simple as saying more regulation is always good.
No, it's way more nuanced than that. It's about finding the right approach for each situation, weighing the pros and cons.
And that's where I think informed citizens like you come in, right? The more we understand these complex issues, the better equipped we are to participate in these debates and advocate for policies that align with our values.
Absolutely. It's easy to get caught up in the abstract ideas, but these regulations have real-world impacts on all of us.
They shape the world we live in.
Exactly. And one of the key takeaways from the source material is that regulation isn't static. It's constantly
We
evolving.
have to adapt as the world changes.
Precisely. And as new challenges emerge, we need to be open to adjusting our approach.
So it's not about finding some perfect solution and then just sticking with it forever.
No, it's a continuous process of evaluation and refinement.
And that's what makes it so interesting.
It really is. The debate about government intervention is always changing. And that's why it's so important to stay informed, to stay curious,
And to stay engaged.
because ultimately these decisions affect all of us. They shape the kind of society we want to live in.
Yeah, it's really interesting to think about how these debates are always shifting, you know? Like the source material really emphasizes that. It's not a set it and forget it kind of thing.
Right, it's a dynamic process.
As technology changes, as society changes, we need to be ready to reevaluate and adapt.
Exactly, and that kind of brings us to the heart of the matter, doesn't it? The effectiveness of regulation. We've talked about the arguments for and against, the potential benefits and downsides, but the question remains, does it actually work?
Yeah, because ultimately we want policies that make a positive impact. And the source material mentions this idea of unintended consequences.
Right?
Can you talk about that a bit more?
Yeah, absolutely. It's crucial to remember that even with the best intentions, sometimes government intervention can have unexpected or even counterproductive outcomes.
Oh, yeah, I can definitely see that.
It's like a ripple effect. You make a change in one area and it can have unforeseen consequences in another.
Do you have an example of that?
Sure. Let's say the government decides to put a price ceiling on rent, for example, to make housing more affordable. Sounds like a good idea on the surface, right?
Yeah, definitely.
But what if that price ceiling ends up discouraging developers from building new housing because their potential profits are limited?
I see where you're going with this.
Suddenly, you have a shortage of available housing, and the very people the policy was supposed to help could end up worse off.
Wow, that's a great example. It really shows how even well-intentioned policies can backfire if they're not carefully thought through.
Yeah, and it highlights the need for constant evaluation and a willingness to adapt.
Like if something isn't working, we need to be able to course correct.
Exactly. And that's why it's so important to have diverse perspectives in policymaking. Economists, legal experts, social scientists, and of course, input from the people who are directly affected.
It's about getting the full picture.
Exactly. We need to consider all angles.
It reminds me of that saying, if you want to go fast, go alone. If you want to go far, go together. Solving complex problems like this requires collaboration and different points of view.
That's a great analogy. At the end of the day, it's about finding solutions that benefit the majority of people, not just a select few.
Yeah, it's about finding that balance.
Balancing individual freedom with collective well-being, promoting innovation while protecting the vulnerable, ensuring that economic progress benefits everyone.
So as we wrap up this deep dive into government intervention, what are some key takeaways you would leave our listeners with?
Well, I think the biggest thing is to remember that this is an ongoing conversation. It's not something that's ever truly settled.
This dynamic.
Exactly. So stay engaged, stay curious, and don't be afraid to challenge your own assumptions.
And I would add, don't underestimate your own role in this process. As informed citizens, we have a responsibility to understand these issues, to participate in these debates, and to advocate for policies that we believe will create a better world.
Absolutely. The future of regulation, the future of our society, really, it depends on all of us. Our willingness to learn, to think critically, and to work together to find solutions.
Well said. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive into government intervention. We hope you found it insightful, and we encourage you to keep exploring these important topics. We'll be back next time for another deep dive into the issues that matter.